2,000 years ago, a man was born in Rome whose name would outlast every empire that followed. He was not born a king, yet he would rule like one. He conquered lands so vast that armies still study his campaigns today. He crossed a river with a single decision that changed the course of Western civilization. Senators who called him friend drove their blades into him on a morning in March, believing they were saving a republic that was already dying. And in his death, Julius Caesar became something even greater than he had been in life, a legend whose shadow still falls across the modern world. Welcome back to Whispered Empires, where ancient worlds rise quietly from the dust and tell their stories one last time. If you find peace in slow history told gently, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if this is the kind of storytelling you truly enjoy. And if the mood is right, leave a comment with where you are in the world and what the hour looks like where you are. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people in different cities and different time zones are settling in tonight for the same story. So let your shoulders drop. Let the day go. Tonight we travel back to the streets of Republican Rome, to the battlefields of Gaul, to the banks of the Rubicon, and to the Senate floor on a cold March morning. And now, let yourself drift into the story of the entire story of Julius Caesar. Chapter 1. The boy from the Julian house, Caesar's origins and early life in the Roman Republic. Somewhere in the warm heart of Rome, in the month the Romans then called Quintilis, a child was born into one of the city's oldest families. The year was 100 BC. Whether the precise day was the 12th or the 13th, history has never quite settled the question, leaving even that small detail wrapped in the gentle uncertainty that surrounds so many ancient lives. What is known is that the boy's name was Gaius Julius Caesar, and that the world into which he arrived was already ancient, already layered with centuries of memory, ambition, and myth. The Julian family, the gens Julia, was patrician in the deepest sense of the word. Their lineage reached back not merely to the earliest days of the Republic, but beyond Rome itself, to the mists of legend and divine ancestry. The Julii traced their bloodline to the Trojan hero Aeneas, the son of the goddess Venus and the mortal Anchises, and from Aeneas came his son Iulus, whose very name gave the family its identity, making Venus herself a kind of distant great-great-grandmother to every child born into this ancient house. For the Romans, divine ancestry was not merely poetry, it was a statement about who a family was, where it stood in the grand order of things and what it was destined to become. Yet for all the grandeur of their mythic roots, the Julii Caesaris of Caesar's own era occupied a somewhat quieter position than their lineage might suggest. Members of the Julian gens had held 33 consulships over the long centuries of the Republic, along with 3 dictatorships and a remarkable number of plebeian offices. But by Caesar's time, the family's wealth had grown modest by the standards of Rome's most powerful aristocratic houses. Their patrician status, which once carried great honour, had in some ways become a constraint, barring them, for instance, from holding the tribunate of the plebs, one of the Republic's most politically potent offices. The Julii were ancient, respected, and connected to the divine, and yet in practical terms they stood at a careful distance from the heights of Roman power. The neighbourhood into which Caesar was born reflected this tension between noble heritage and modest means. His family lived in the Subura, a densely populated and often noisy district of Rome, far from the elegant hilltop estates of the wealthiest senatorial families. It was a neighbourhood of tradespeople, craftsmen, and the urban poor, a place where the rhythms of everyday Roman life played out against a backdrop of crowded streets and close-built tenement houses. For a boy of patrician blood growing up in such surroundings, the distance between ancient ancestry and present circumstance must have been felt keenly. But the family's connections extended well beyond their own modest circumstances. Caesar's Aunt Julia had married a man of enormous consequence, Gaius Marius, the celebrated general who had already, by the time of Caesar's birth, risen to hold the consulship multiple times. Marius was a figure unlike almost any other in Roman history. Born of modest equestrian origins, he had climbed to the very summit of Roman power, not through inherited aristocratic privilege, but through military brilliance and a talent for political survival. His 7 consulships, the first and only time in the Republic's history that any man had held the office so many times, marked him as a force that had fundamentally altered what was possible in Roman public life. The military reforms Marius had instituted were equally transformative. By opening the Roman legions to all citizens, regardless of property, he had created a professional standing army, one equipped with standardized weapons, organized around the cohort, and bound by loyalty not to the Senate as an institution, but to the general who led them and paid them and brought them victory. It was a change whose consequences would ripple forward through the decades, reshaping the Republic in ways that perhaps even Marius himself had not fully foreseen. Armies that served their commanders could be turned against political rivals. The legions that had once defended the state could be marched upon Rome itself. For the young Caesar, this connection to Marius was not merely a point of family pride. It was a political inheritance, a positioning within the great factional struggles that defined the late Republic. Roman politics in those years was organized loosely but meaningfully around 2 broad orientations. The optimates were the defenders of senatorial tradition, the men who believed that Rome's strength lay in the authority of the Senate and the careful preservation of existing hierarchies. The populares were something different. Politicians who sought the backing of the popular assemblies, who spoke the language of reform, and who were willing to challenge senatorial dominance to advance their aims. Marius had been a populares man, a commander who had risen through popular support and who represented, at least in the public imagination, a different kind of Roman ambition. Into this divided world Caesar was born, already connected, through his aunt's marriage, to the populares tradition, already carrying within his family name both divine ancestry and political meaning. The early years of his life were shadowed by violence that must have been almost incomprehensible to a child. When Caesar was still very young, Rome descended into civil war. Marius and his ally Cinna seized the city. Then came Sulla, Lucius Cornelius. Sulla, a general of formidable ability and ruthless political will, who marched his legions on Rome itself, a thing that had never before been done, and who eventually emerged victorious at the Battle of the Colline Gate in 82 BC. What followed was the Republic's first experience of something terrifyingly new. Proscription lists posted in the Forum, naming those who could be killed on sight, their property seized, their descendants stripped of civic rights and political futures. Thousands perished. The city moved through those days in a kind of stunned, fearful silence. Caesar's name appeared on one of those lists. He was, by some accounts, barely into his teenage years, and yet the connection to Marius through his Aunt Julia was enough to make him a marked figure. He survived only because influential relatives interceded, because his mother Aurelia advocated for him, because the Vestal Virgins, who held the unique privilege of pleading for the condemned, appeared before Sulla and asked for clemency. Sulla in the end relented, though not without a remark that has echoed through the centuries, that in the boy Caesar there were many Mariuses, but survival alone was not enough to satisfy Sulla. The dictator demanded something more, that Caesar divorce his wife Cornelia, She was the daughter of Cinna, Marius's closest ally and Rome's leading popularis voice, and Sulla understood perfectly well what that marriage meant. It was a bond to the very faction he had spent his civil war destroying. He wanted it severed. Caesar refused. It was, for a young man in a city ruled by a dictator who had just demonstrated his willingness to kill thousands, an act of extraordinary defiance. He refused to dissolve the marriage, went into hiding, was forced to leave Rome and take up military service in Asia Minor, and yet he held. Cornelia remained his wife. The marriage that connected him to Cinna, to Marius, to the populares tradition endured. Eventually, after Sulla's death in 78 BC removed the immediate threat, Caesar was able to return to Rome. During those years of military service abroad, something else occurred that would later become one of the most famous anecdotes of the ancient world. In 75 BC, while sailing in the Aegean, Caesar's vessel was seized by Cilician pirates. He was taken to the small island of Pharmacusa and held for ransom. The pirates set their price at 20 talents. Caesar laughed at them. He told them they had no idea whom they had captured, and he insisted they demand 50. For 38 days he remained among them, and in that time he behaved not as a hostage, but as a commander. He ordered them to be quiet when he wished to sleep. He recited poetry and speeches and expected them to listen and to admire. He joined their games and exercises, but always from a position of self-possessed authority, and he told them with a kind of calm certainty that must have unsettled them even as they laughed it off, that once he was free he would return, capture every one of them, and have them crucified. When the ransom was paid and he was released, he went directly to the nearby port of Miletus, assembled a fleet, sailed back to Pharmacusa, captured the pirates and had them crucified, though, as a concession to the mercy he wished to be seen extending, he ordered their throats cut first that the end came quickly. The vow had been made. The vow was kept. This episode, remarkable in itself, illuminates something essential about the young Caesar that no list of offices or family connections quite captures. There was in him a quality of composed, almost theatrical self-belief, a sense that the world would, in the end, arrange itself according to his intentions. It was not recklessness. It was something more considered, more deliberate, and in its own way more formidable. Back in Rome, Caesar began the slow, disciplined climb that Roman political tradition demanded. The cursus honorum, the ordered sequence of offices that governed a senator's career, required patience and adherence to form. Military service, then quaestor, then aedile, then praetor, then consul. Each step had its minimum age, its prerequisites, its proper place in the sequence. Caesar had received the education appropriate to his station: Latin and Greek grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, the art of precise and persuasive argument. He had even, during his early military service in Asia Minor under the praetor Marcus Minucius Thermus, earned the corona civica, or the civic crown, one of Rome's highest military honours, for bravery at the siege of Mytilene. He was elected quaestor around 69 BC and served in the province of Hispania Citerior. That same year, his wife Cornelia died. He returned to Rome and delivered her funeral oration, and then, at his Aunt Julia's funeral shortly afterward, he delivered another speech that resonated far beyond the occasion itself. Standing before the assembled mourners, Caesar spoke of his family's divine descent from Venus, of their connection to the ancient kings of Rome, of the memory of Marius. It was simultaneously a eulogy and a political declaration, a carefully crafted assertion of who the Julius Caesars were and what they intended to become. The aedileship followed in 65 BC, and with it came Caesar's first large-scale public display. He staged lavish games, funded spectacles the city would not soon forget, decorated Rome with monuments, and spent with a freedom that his actual finances did not quite support. He was already in debt, a condition that would deepen as his ambitions grew. By the time he stood on the edge of the praetorship, he owed sums that would have crushed a lesser man. It was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest Roman of the age, who stepped in, paying off some 830 talents of Caesar's obligations and ensuring that the political career continued. Debt in this way was not merely a burden, it was a kind of currency, a measure of ambition, and in Caesar's hands it became a tool through which powerful men were drawn into partnership with him, each believing they were the one doing the steering. In 63 BC, Caesar secured election to the position of Pontifex Maximus, the highest religious office in Rome. The office conferred both prestige and practical advantage, including a residence in the Forum itself. His election surprised those who had expected a more established senator to claim it. Caesar had calculated his chances carefully, borrowed heavily to fund the campaign, and won. He was 36 years old, deeply in debt, without a large personal fortune, positioned on the populares side of Roman politics, carrying the name of a family connected to gods, to heroes, and to a general who had transformed the Roman army, and he was only beginning. From these early years of survival, ambition, and careful manoeuvring, Caesar would carry forward lessons that no political education could teach, that boldness often defeats caution, and that the right alliances at the right moment can lift a man far beyond what talent alone ever could. Chapter 2. The Climb to Power, Caesar's political career, the First Triumvirate, and the road to Gaul. Rome was a city that moved slowly, even when it moved with purpose. Its marble colonnades caught the morning light in long golden ribbons. Its forums filled with the murmur of commerce and argument, and along those ancient stone corridors of public life, a man named Julius Caesar was learning, step by careful step, how power was truly won. His earliest foothold in public life came quietly enough. Around 81 to 79 BC, Caesar served as a military tribune in Asia Minor, an early posting that placed him within sight of legions and governors and the broader machinery of Roman authority. Apprenticeship of observation, and Caesar, by all accounts, was a careful student. In 69 BC, he entered the formal ladder of a Roman public office, the cursus honorum, as a quaestor, serving in Hispania Citerior under the governor Antistius Vetus. The quaestor was the lowest rung of that ancient ladder, a magistrate charged with overseeing the treasury, auditing financial records, collecting taxes, and tending to the grain supply. In the Spanish provinces, Caesar travelled through vast landscapes of unfamiliar terrain, adjudicating local disputes, managing the flow of grain, and learning the quiet, patient art of provincial administration. It was unglamorous work, largely invisible to the crowds of Rome, but it earned him a seat in the Senate, and that in the long architecture of his ambitions was everything. When he returned to Rome, Caesar understood something that many of his contemporaries had not yet fully grasped. In the Republic, popularity was a currency as real as silver, and popularity, he discovered, could be purchased if one was willing to accept the debt that came with it. In 65 BC, Caesar was elected curule aedile, a magistracy responsible for the city's streets, markets, public buildings, and the great spectacles that Romans held so dearly. Caesar transformed this administrative office into something far more theatrical. He staged gladiatorial games of breathtaking extravagance, most famously a display featuring 320 pairs of gladiators armoured in gleaming silver, a spectacle that drew crowds from every corner of the city. He commissioned building projects. He filled the public spaces of Rome with beauty and performance. The masses adored him. The Senate watched with growing unease, but generosity of this scale carried a price. Caesar had spent well beyond his modest family resources. His debts had grown so large that his creditors once detained him in Rome to prevent him from leaving, unwilling to let him disappear beyond their reach. It was at this moment that a man of enormous wealth and calculated patience stepped forward. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, perhaps the richest man in the known world, saw in Caesar something worth investing in. In 62 BC, Crassus extended a loan of roughly 830 talents, an almost incomprehensible sum representing approximately 1/8 of his own fortune. This financial intervention cleared enough of Caesar's obligations to allow him to continue climbing. Crassus became Caesar's chief creditor, and with that arrangement, a quiet but significant alliance was born between two men who each possessed something the other lacked. In 63 BC, Caesar achieved something that surprised even his rivals. He won election to the office of Pontifex Maximus, the highest religious office in the Roman state, a lifetime appointment that carried with it immense prestige and practical influence over religious law, the calendar, and the appointment of priests. It elevated his public standing dramatically, gave him a permanent platform from which to address the Senate, and placed him, in the eyes of the Roman people, among the most venerable figures in public life. He would hold this position until his death. That same year, 63 BC, Rome was shaken by the Catiline conspiracy, a plot by the disgruntled senator Lucius Sergius Catilina to overthrow the government by force, drawing together indebted veterans, dispossessed farmers, and desperate men of every station who had been promised debt relief and the removal of their enemies. The consul Cicero uncovered the plot and ordered the conspirators executed without trial. Caesar, who had previously shown some sympathy for Catiline's electoral ambitions, argued publicly against summary execution, urging instead that the men be imprisoned until proper judicial proceedings could be arranged. It was a position that placed him in opposition to Cicero and to much of the Senate, and it was noted carefully by those who were already learning to watch him. In 62 BC, Caesar served as praetor, advancing one more rung along the ancient ladder. And then, in 61 BC, came the governorship of further Spain, Hispania Ulteria, where he finally had the chance to command legions in the field, to conduct military campaigns against local tribes, and to return to Rome with the first faint shadow of a general's reputation beginning to gather around his name. But Rome in his absence had not been still. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, had returned from the east in 61 BC, draped in the glory of extraordinary conquest. He had swept the Mediterranean clean of Cilician pirates in a campaign so swift and decisive it seemed almost mythological. He had ended the long and draining Third Mithridatic War. He had reorganized the entire Eastern world, creating new Roman provinces in Bithynia and Pontus, in Cilicia and Syria, establishing client kingdoms as buffers against distant Parthia, reshaping the political geography of the Near East with the calm authority of a man who believed Rome's power extended as far as his own ambition. He had celebrated a third triumph, a rare and luminous honour. And yet, when he stood before the Senate and asked them to ratify his eastern settlements, the treaties he had negotiated, the land distributions for his veterans, the new provincial arrangements he had so carefully constructed, the Senate refused. The Optimates, those conservative guardians of traditional senatorial authority, led by the unyielding Cato the Younger, had no interest in handing Pompey the political validation he believed he had earned. They blocked his legislation. They withheld the honours he expected. They left him standing in the cold corridors of the Forum with all his military glory and none of the political rewards that should have accompanied it. Pompey was frustrated, and frustrated, powerful men in Rome were dangerous. Marcus Licinius Crassus had his own grievances with the Senate. The equestrian businessmen he represented, the publicani, the great tax farming companies, had overbid for the lucrative contracts to collect taxes in the province of Asia. When the contracts proved impossible to meet, Crassus pressed the Senate to renegotiate the terms on their behalf. Cato the Younger, as predictable as the turning of the seasons, blocked every effort. The Senate, in his view, owed no favours to men of commerce, and so in the year 60 BC, three men with separate frustrations and separate ambitions came to stand quietly in the same shadow. Caesar recognised what each of the others lacked. Pompey had military glory and a loyal veteran army, but no political mechanism to turn that glory into legislation. Crassus had wealth that could move mountains of influence, but no popular following to sustain his goals. Caesar himself had the popular touch, the political instincts, and the rhetorical skill to navigate the assemblies and the forum, but he lacked the money and the military prestige to force his agenda past a hostile Senate. Together, however, they would be something the Senate had never quite encountered before. Caesar approached Crassus first, drawing on years of financial obligation and shared political interest. Then he turned to Pompey, offering a formal amicitia, a bond of friendship and mutual support, and promising to use his political influence to push through legislation that would give Pompey everything the Senate had refused him. To seal the arrangement with something more permanent than words, Caesar gave Pompey his only daughter, Julia, in marriage. It was an alliance forged in debt and ambition, cemented by family, and kept secret from the wider world for as long as it could be. This informal coalition, later known to history as the First Triumvirate, was not a legal institution. It held no official status in Roman law. It was simply three powerful men who had agreed to use their combined resources to achieve what none of them could accomplish alone. In 59 BC, Caesar stood for the consulship, the highest elected office in the Republic, and won with Crassus's money and Pompey's prestige quietly arranging the terrain ahead of him. His consular colleague was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a conservative senator of firm republican conviction who had no intention of watching Caesar remake Rome without resistance. Bibulus tried everything. He invoked ancient religious procedures, announcing that he would watch the heavens for omens, a legal mechanism that could suspend public assemblies. He issued edicts declaring Caesar's proceedings void. He attempted to filibuster, but Caesar was not a man who moved slowly when speed was necessary. When Bibulus entered the forum to obstruct the vote on an agrarian bill, Caesar's supporters surrounded him. His fasces, the ceremonial rods that symbolized his authority, were broken. He retreated eventually to his house, where he continued to issue formal objections to legislation that was already becoming law. The Roman wits of the year took to calling the consulship not of Caesar and Bibulus, but simply of Julius and Caesar. The legislation Caesar pushed through that year was sweeping. He passed agrarian reforms, most notably the Lex Julia de Agro Campano, distributing land in Campania to veterans, particularly the soldiers of Pompey's army, thereby fulfilling at last the obligation the Senate had denied for years. He secured the formal ratification of Pompey's eastern settlements. He passed anti-corruption measures aimed at curbing provincial abuses. He arranged a significant reduction in the outstanding tax farming obligations that Crassus had been pressing the Senate to relieve, and through the tribune Publius Vatinius, he secured something for himself, the Lex Vatinia, which granted Caesar a 5-year proconsular command over Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, along with the legions already stationed there and the right to appoint his own officers. When the governor designate of Transalpine Gaul, the lands beyond the Alps, died unexpectedly, that province was added to Caesar's command as well. The arrangement was not purely about ambition, though ambition certainly played its part. There was also the quiet matter of legal protection. Under Roman law, a magistrate holding imperium, the formal military authority of a provincial command, could not be brought to trial on ordinary charges. Caesar's enemies had prepared long lists of grievances, alleged corruption during his consulship, procedural abuses, violations of law, the heavy-handed methods he'd employed to force his legislation past a paralysed Senate. The moment Caesar laid down his command and returned to Rome as a private citizen, those charges would be waiting for him. By staying in Gaul, by maintaining his provincial authority, Caesar remained untouchable. His command was not only an opportunity, it was a shield. To the north and west, beyond the familiar edges of Roman-controlled territory, lay Gaul. A vast and ancient world of independent Celtic tribes, of forested highlands and wide river valleys, of fierce warrior cultures and shifting alliances that had endured for centuries before Rome had thought to look in their direction. The Aedui, the Arverni, the Helvetii, the Nervii, the Belgic confederations each held their own territory, their own loyalties, their own pride. Some, like the Aedui, had maintained a long and sometimes uneasy friendship with Rome. Others regarded the Roman presence in the southern province with a slow and patient suspicion. In 58 BC, a particular crisis presented itself. The Helvetii, a Celtic people from the high plateau now known as Switzerland, had set their entire nation in motion. Some 368,000 people gathered their families, burned their settlements so there would be no turning back, and began moving westward through Roman-controlled territory in search of new and more fertile lands. Their passage disrupted allied tribes. Their numbers threatened Roman interests. The Aedui appealed for Roman protection. It was exactly the kind of moment Caesar had been waiting for. A pretext dressed in the language of obligation and alliance that would allow him to move legions, to fight, to win, and to begin writing the story that would one day outlast the Republic itself. With the consulship behind him and Gaul spread before him like an unwritten page of history, Caesar rode north carrying the ambitions of a man who understood that the greatest power in Rome was not found in the Senate chamber but on the battlefield, and he was determined to prove it. Chapter 3: The Conquest of Gaul, Caesar's Wars, Vercingetorix, and the Battle of Alesia. To the west of the known Roman world, beyond the sheltered valleys of the Mediterranean and past the last familiar hills of Narbonensis, stretched a vast and ancient land, or a territory of nearly 500,000 square kilometres, shaped by slow rivers and dense forests, by mountain ranges that caught the clouds and coastal plains that opened quietly to the Atlantic. The Seine wound through its northern reaches, the Loire curved through its heart, the Rhône pressed southward toward the sea. It was a land of fertile soil and long memory, divided in Roman understanding into several great territories. Gallia Celtica in the centre, Gallia Belgica pressing toward the northern Germanic frontier, Aquitania along the Atlantic south, and the already Romanized Narbonensis along the Mediterranean fringe. Within those territories lived peoples of extraordinary variety, not a single nation, but a world of tribes and confederations, each with its own councils, its own loyalties, its own ways of choosing leaders. The Aedui of central Gaul had long maintained ties with Rome. The Arverni, powerful and proud, remembered a time when their name carried weight across the whole of the Western world. The Helvetii of the Swiss plateau moved according to the rhythms of ancient migration, and in the north, the Belgae, a loose confederation of tribes including the fierce Nervae, the Atrebates, and others, watched the Roman frontier with cautious eyes. In the year 58 BC, Julius Caesar arrived in Gaul as its governor. He was a man of enormous political ambition, extraordinary intelligence, and a gift for turning circumstances to his advantage. The wars that followed would last 8 years and reshape the Western world. The first crisis came almost immediately. The Helvetii, a Celtic confederation of the Swiss plateau, had organised a massive westward migration. Some 360,000 men, women, children and livestock moving toward new lands in the west, intending to pass through territory Rome considered its own sphere of influence. Caesar moved swiftly. He portrayed the migration as a threat to Roman allies and to the stability of the frontier, demanded the Helvetii abandon their route, and when they pressed on regardless, he brought his legions forward to meet them. At the Battle of Bibracte, the Romans engaged the Helvetii and defeated them decisively, forcing the survivors to return to the lands they had left. The victory was swift, and Caesar used it to justify a deeper Roman presence throughout Gaul. Within that same year, another matter presented itself. A Germanic chieftain named Ariovistus, king of the Suebi, had crossed the Rhine and settled in the Alsace region, where he had once been welcomed as an ally by certain Gallic tribes but had since claimed enormous tracts of land as his own. The Aedui, Rome's longtime friends in Gaul, appealed to Caesar for help. Caesar marched into the Vosges, outmaneuvered Ariovistus through careful positioning, and when the decisive moment arrived, he deployed his 6 legions in a triple line and committed his reserve at the right instant, breaking the Germanic formation. Ariovistus's forces fled toward the Rhine, and the Germanic threat to central Gaul dissolved. In 57 BC, Caesar turned his attention northward. The Belgic tribes had moved against Roman allies, and Caesar marched a force of roughly 35,000 to 40,000 legionaries and auxiliaries into their territory. Near the river Sabis, known today as the Sambre, the Nervii, joined by the Atrebates and Viramandui, launched a sudden ambush while the Romans were still building their camp. The attack nearly overwhelmed the legions. Standards were seized, centurions fell. Caesar himself took up a shield and went among his men, rallying them by presence alone. When the 10th Legion arrived with reinforcements, the assault was turned back and the Belgic offensive broken. The tribes of the north, one by one, submitted. The following year brought a different kind of war. The Veneti, a seafaring people of the Atlantic coast, held fortified headlands and commanded a fleet of 220 large oak ships, broad-hulled, sail-powered vessels that rose high from the water and could not be rammed effectively by Roman galleys. Caesar had a new fleet constructed on the Loire and sent it under his commander Decimus Brutus Albinus to face them. The Romans recognized that boarding would not work against ships so much taller than their own, and so they armed their galleys with long poles tipped with iron billhooks, using them to seize and cut the Veneti's rigging, collapsing their sails and leaving the great ships dead in the water. Then the Roman oarsmen surrounded them and boarded. The Atlantic coast fell under Roman control. In 55 and 54 BC, Caesar crossed the sea to Britain, not to conquer, but to demonstrate. The Britons had offered refuge and support to Gallic tribes resisting Rome, and Caesar wished to punish that, to gather intelligence, and to add the prestige of a crossing to his name in Rome. The first expedition, with 2 legions, was brief and troubled by storms that wrecked much of his fleet. The second was far larger, 5 legions, 2,000 cavalry, some 800 ships. He marched inland through Kent, forced the Britons to battle at a river crossing, pressed north to the Thames and imposed tribute on the coalition led by Cassivellaunus. A nominal peace was arranged, and Caesar departed without leaving a garrison. Britain would remain unconquered for another century. That same year of 55 BC, Caesar also crossed the Rhine. He built a massive wooden bridge across the great river, an engineering feat that announced Roman power as clearly as any battle, and marched his legions briefly into Germanic territory to punish tribes that had raided Gaul and to warn others that the Rhine was no safe boundary. He crossed again in 53 BC for the same purposes. The message was plain. Rome could reach anywhere, but the campaign was not without its shadows. In the winter of 54 BC, a catastrophe unfolded among the Belgic tribe of the Eburones. Their leader, a war chief named Ambiorix, lured the Roman officers Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta out of their fortified winter camp with false promises of safe passage, then ambushed and destroyed their force of roughly 9,000 legionaries and auxiliaries. Almost none survived. It was one of the gravest Roman losses in the entire Gallic campaign. Caesar answered it with swift and devastating punishment, pursuing the Eburones until their people were effectively exterminated, racing to relieve other besieged Roman positions, and raising his forces to meet the wider uprising that Ambiorix had helped ignite. Through all of these campaigns, certain qualities marked Caesar as a commander unlike most others of his time. He moved with what his men called celeritas, a speed that left enemies unprepared. He crossed rivers in a day, appeared before fortified towns before they expected him, launched winter offensives when Gallic tribes believed the season held them safe. He used cavalry, archers, and allied contingents as flexible tools. He built what was needed, bridges, camps, siege works, with extraordinary efficiency. He rewarded his men generously from the spoils of conquest, distributing gold, silver, land, and enslaved peoples. Over 8 years, those legions ceased to belong abstractly to Rome. They belonged in a deeper and more personal sense to Caesar. And then came 52 BC and the war that changed everything. Among the Arverni, a tribe of central Gaul whose ancestors had once commanded prestige across the Western world before their defeat by Rome in 121 BC, there was a young nobleman of exceptional ability. His name was Vercingetorix. His father, Caltillus, had been killed by fellow Arverni nobles after attempting to restore the old kingship, a warning that even among his own people, ambition could be fatal. Vercingetorix was educated as a member of the tribal elite, connected to the networks of Gallic aristocracy, and possessed of a strategic mind rare even by the standards of commanders Rome had faced in Gaul. In early 52 BC, the tribes of central and western Gaul rose together. The catalyst was a massacre at the town of Cenabum, where Roman merchants were killed. The fire of revolt spread. Vercingetorix, who had been expelled from Gergovia by a pro-Roman faction, returned with supporters, seized the city, expelled his enemies, and was acclaimed king of the Arverni. Within weeks, the assembled tribal chiefs of Gaul chose him as their overall commander, the first man ever to lead a coordinated pan-tribal resistance against Rome in Gaul. His strategy was deliberate and patient. He understood that Gallic warriors, brave as they were, could not simply stand against Roman legions in open battle and expect to prevail. Instead, he chose attrition. He ordered the burning of towns, the destruction of crops, the slaughter of livestock, anything that might supply a Roman army. He instructed his cavalry to harass Caesar's foraging parties, to cut off small detachments, to make every day of the Roman campaign a struggle for sustenance. He would starve the Romans into weakness, then strike. Vercingetorix ordered the burning of more than 20 settlements across Gallic territory, In a single campaign season, fires visible from miles away, plumes of smoke rising over a scorched landscape. When the Bituriges tribe pleaded that their beautiful capital, Avaricum, renowned as the finest city in all of Gaul, should be spared, the Gauls could not bring themselves to destroy it. Vercingetorix relented. He would come to regret it. Caesar besieged Avaricum, and after 27 days took it. But at Gergovia, the fortified hilltop oppidum of the Arverni and Vercingetorix's own stronghold, Caesar suffered a rare defeat. His troops, emboldened by early success, pressed the assault further than ordered, became exposed on the steep walls, and were struck by a fierce Gallic counterattack that cost roughly 700 legionaries and 46 centurions. Caesar was forced to withdraw. It was one of the few moments in the entire Gallic Wars where his army had been genuinely bested in the field. The defeat encouraged wavering tribes and strengthened the resolve of the rebellion. Caesar recovered. After defeating Gallic cavalry along the Vinjan and securing the wavering loyalty of the Aedui, he pressed Vercingetorix southward and westward. The Gallic commander, his cavalry broken in that engagement, made a calculated decision. He withdrew to Alesia, a great hilltop oppidum sitting on a steep-sided plateau in the territory of the Mandubai, with two rivers running at its feet and natural slopes on every side. He would hold there, endure a siege, and wait for the relief army that all of Gaul was being called to send. What happened next at Alesia in the autumn of 52 BC stands as one of the most astonishing feats of military engineering in the ancient world. Caesar recognized that a direct assault on Alesia's slopes would be costly and uncertain, so instead he chose to encircle it completely. In roughly 3 weeks, his legions constructed an inner ring of circumvallation approximately 18 kilometers long, a continuous wall of packed earth rising some 4 meters high, formed from the spoil of 2 parallel ditches, each about 4.5 meters wide and deep. The inner one flooded to create a water-filled moat. Along the top of the wall ran a wooden palisade and parapet, and timber towers rose every 18 to 20 meters. Before the wall, the ground was seeded with rows of iron-hooked wooden blocks, concealed pits filled with sharpened stakes, man-traps and obstacles designed to break any charge before it reached the rampart. And then, knowing that Vercingetorix had sent riders out before the encirclement closed to summon a relief army from all the tribes of Gaul, Caesar built a second ring, an outer contravallation facing away from Alesia, running some 21 kilometers around the outside of the Roman position. The same construction, the same obstacles, the same towers, designed to hold off whatever force might come to break the siege from the outside. Rome's army now sat between 2 walls, facing inward and outward simultaneously, prepared to fight on 2 fronts. The relief army that gathered was enormous. Ancient accounts place it at roughly 100,000 Gallic warriors, drawn from tribes across the whole of the country, a final desperate marshalling of Gallic strength. They came with cavalry, with infantry, with the hope that the sight of so many would break Roman resolve. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched and waited. Supplies dwindled. At one point, in a grim decision, the Mandubai civilians, the people whose home the oppidum was, were driven from the walls and out into the space between the town and the Roman lines to spare the defenders' remaining food. Caesar refused to let them through his lines. They remained stranded in the open ground, a tragic witness to the mathematics of siege. The relief army attacked the outer Roman wall. Vercingetorix launched simultaneous assaults from within. For days, the Romans fought on both sides of their double ring, rushing troops from sector to sector, holding ground that seemed impossible to hold. The crisis came when the relief force found a weakness in the outer wall on a steep hillside where the Roman line had not been fully completed, a gap that, if exploited, could breach the entire containment and allow coordination with Vercingetorix's forces breaking outward at the same moment. At that moment, Caesar rode forward himself. He gathered 4 cohorts and a contingent of cavalry, swept around the outside of the threatened position, and led a counterattack that struck the invading Gauls from the rear. His distinctive red cloak, worn so his men could recognize him in the chaos of battle, moved through the dust and shouting. The Gallic assault collapsed. The relief army began to break. Those outside the Roman walls who could flee did so. Those inside Alesia, their supplies exhausted and their hope extinguished, had nowhere to go. The morning after the final assault, Vercingetorix called the tribal chiefs of Alesia together. He told them that he had fought for the freedom of Gaul not for his own sake, and that they should decide whether to give him to the Romans dead or alive. Then he rode out from the gates of Alesia, approached the place where Caesar sat before his commanders, dismounted from his horse, cast off his armour, and knelt. He laid his weapons at Caesar's feet and said nothing further. He was taken in chains to Rome. For 6 years, Vercingetorix was held in the Tullianum, the old stone prison at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. In 46 BC, Caesar celebrated his triumph, a procession through the streets of Rome marking his victories in Gaul, Egypt, and elsewhere. Vercingetorix was displayed before the Roman crowds. Shortly afterward, he was executed in the Tullianum by strangulation, the last act of a resistance that had come closer than any other to driving Rome from Gaul. The wars did not end entirely at Alesia. Scattered revolts continued into 51 BC, most notably at the oppidum of Uxellodunum in the territory of the Cadurci, where Caesar besieged the defenders, cut off their water supply and forced surrender. The rebel leaders had their hands cut off as a warning. In the following year, remaining pockets of resistance were cleared away, and Roman forts, roads, and garrisons began to settle into the landscape of Gaul as permanent features. The human cost of those 8 years was staggering. Ancient writers such as Plutarch and Appian recorded figures of 1 million killed and a comparable number enslaved, numbers that modern historians regard as greatly exaggerated, though the true toll, estimated in the tens of thousands dead, still represented the devastation of whole peoples and the erasure of entire communities. Caesar himself grew immensely wealthy from the campaigns. The gold, silver, and human captives of Gaul flowed into his treasury and allowed him to build the political foundations of what was to come. He also left a written record. The Commentarii de Bello Gallico, his own account of the campaigns, composed in a spare and precise third-person Latin, described the geography of Gaul, the customs of its tribes, the movements of his armies, and the great engagements from Bibracte to Alesia. It began with the famous observation that all of Gaul was divided into 3 parts. Written as both a military record and a political document, it shaped how Rome understood the north and west, how it understood the people Caesar had subdued, and how Caesar wished posterity to understand him. Back in Rome, each new dispatch from the north had arrived like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward. The crowd celebrated. His prestige swelled. 17 days of public thanksgiving were decreed after Alesia, more than had ever been granted to any Roman commander. But in the Senate chambers and the private rooms of the powerful, other calculations were being made. The conference at Lucca in 56 BC had briefly renewed the alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, securing Caesar a 5-year extension of his command in Gaul, while Pompey and Crassus received consulships and provincial commands of their own. For a time, the 3 men had balanced the Roman world between them. But balance is a fragile thing. In 54 BC, Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, the human bond between the two most powerful men in Rome, died in childbirth. In 53 BC, Crassus died in the disaster at Caere, deep in the Parthian East, taking with him the wealth and the independent standing that had helped keep the three-way arrangement stable. What had been a triangle became a line between two men who had always, beneath the alliance, been rivals. Gaul had been conquered and Vercingetorix lay in chains, but in Rome the political foundations beneath Caesar's victories were quietly crumbling, and the men who had once called themselves his allies were already choosing sides against him. Chapter 4: Crossing the Rubicon, Civil War, Pharsalus, and Caesar's pursuit of Pompey to Egypt. For years, the Roman world had balanced itself upon a delicate arrangement of ambition, law, and mutual restraint. But by the close of 51 BC, that balance had grown thin and fragile, like ice stretched too far across a winter river. At the heart of the crisis was a question that seemed simple on its surface yet carried the weight of empire beneath it. Julius Caesar, governor of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, had been granted his military command years before by a law known as the Lex Vitinia. That command had been extended. His campaigns in Gaul were winding toward their conclusion. And now, conservative voices in the Senate, led by the consul Gaius Claudius Marcellus, were calling for Caesar to step down, to surrender his legions, and to allow a successor to be named. But Caesar's allies in the tribunate moved to block each proposal. In 50 BC, the tribune Gaius Scribonius Curio vetoed the Senate's attempts. In 49 BC, it was Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius Longinus who stood against the motion. Their resistance only deepened the rupture. On the 1st of December, 50 BC, the Senate passed a resolution calling for both Caesar and Pompey to lay down their commands simultaneously, a resolution immediately overruled by Marcellus, who then, without senatorial authority, offered Pompey command of all Italian forces. Caesar, ever seeking compromise, sent a careful proposal on the first day of January 49 BC. He offered to surrender his command in Gaul to disband the bulk of his veteran legions, to withdraw to Illyricum with only a single legion, enough to protect his standing for a second consulship. He asked only that Pompey do the same, that both men set aside their armies and return governance to ordinary hands. It was, in many ways, a generous offer. The Senate rejected it. The reply that came back was unambiguous. If Caesar did not disarm by a date yet to be fixed, he would be declared a public enemy of Rome. The Senatus Consultum Ultimum had been invoked. Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius Longinus, expelled from the city after their vetoes, fled Rome and took refuge with Caesar in the north. The constitutional framework that had contained the crisis had now collapsed entirely. Caesar understood what this meant. To return to Rome without his army was to invite prosecution, political ruin, and the loss of everything he had spent decades building. Yet to keep his army was to be named an outlaw. There was no comfortable middle path left. The die, as it were, was already beginning to fall. In the darkness of January, on the 10th or 11th day of that month in 49 BC, Caesar stood at the banks of a shallow river in northeastern Italy, the Rubicon. It was not a wide or imposing river. It was not deep nor dramatic in appearance, but it was something more significant than any landscape could convey. By Roman law, no general holding imperium, no provincial commander with his army, was permitted to bring armed men across that river and into Italy proper. To do so was to break the law, to forfeit his command, to declare war upon the Senate itself. And yet, after a long and quiet pause that ancient writers describe with careful reverence, Caesar led his single legion, the 13th, across the water. The ancient biographers preserved his words from that moment, though they differ slightly in their accounts. Suetonius records him saying in Latin the words that have echoed across 2,000 years, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. Plutarch preserves a slightly different version, the Greek imperative from a Menander comedy, meaning "let the die be cast," suggesting Caesar himself understood the magnitude of the gamble, framing the moment with the language of theatre and fate. Appian adds that Caesar seemed to speak like a man possessed, as though something greater than himself were moving through him. Whatever the precise words, their meaning was the same. An irreversible step had been taken. There would be no returning from this river, who had reached Rome swiftly, and the city came undone with fear. The streets emptied. Senators and their families gathered what they could and fled. Ancient writers describe an atmosphere haunted by strange omens, wolves seen wandering near the gates, an earthquake, a comet crossing the sky, a solar eclipse that darkened the Forum. Whether these signs were truly observed or later added by those wishing to frame the civil war as cosmically fated, they speak to the terror that gripped a city unprepared for what was coming. Pompey, once the great general of the Roman world, found himself without enough loyal troops to mount a defence. He retreated south, first to Brundisium on the heel of the Italian peninsula, and then sailed east across the Adriatic to Greece, leaving Rome behind to whatever fate Caesar would bring. Caesar entered the city without bloodshed. He moved through its streets not as a conqueror demanding terror, but as a man who wished, at least in appearance, to repair what had been broken. His policy of clemency, clementia as the Romans called it, became one of the defining qualities of his conduct throughout the civil war. Unlike the brutal proscriptions of Sulla a generation before, Caesar did not pursue mass executions or vendettas against the senatorial class. He released captured opponents, returned seized property, and pardoned men who had stood against him. Famously, after the rapid surrender of Corfinium, he freed the entire body of captured aristocrats without punishment. Conquest, he declared, would be achieved by mercy and generosity. Yet the war was far from over. Pompey had left powerful, well-supplied armies in Spain, and Caesar understood he could not simply sail east in pursuit while enemy legions waited at his back. And so he turned west first, marching to confront those forces before they could become a threat. Along the way, the city of Massilia, the great Greek-founded port on the southern coast of Gaul, closed its gates against him. Caesar left Gaius Trebonius and Decimus Brutus to conduct the siege while he continued into Spain. The Massiliotes fought with ingenuity, using rope-driven winches to stop Roman battering rams, launching night sorties to burn siege equipment, and relying on a naval harbour to bring in Pompeian reinforcements. But months of blockade, bombardment and hunger eventually broke the city's resistance. It surrendered when Caesar returned from Spain, its weapons, ships and treasury handed over, the city itself spared but stripped of its independence. In Spain, Caesar moved against Pompey's legates Lucius Afranius and Marcus Petreius. Through strategic manoeuvring, most notably the clever diversion of a river near the town of Ilerda that cut off the Pompeian forces from their supplies, Caesar forced their surrender without the need for a great pitched battle. The legates were allowed to leave on condition that they not rejoin Pompey. The western provinces were secured. Now Caesar could turn his gaze east. Crossing the Adriatic was its own ordeal. The Roman navy under Bibulus was actively hunting Caesar's transports, and winter storms churned the waters into something hostile and grey. Caesar could muster only enough vessels to carry roughly half his legions. Nevertheless, he pressed on, landing a force of 7 understrength legions near Apollonia on the western coast of Greece. Bibulus struck on the return trip, destroying some 30 transports and cutting off the remainder of Caesar's army. He would spend weeks operating in Greece with limited forces and no reliable naval support, facing a Pompeian fleet of 300 ships he could not match. Gnaeus Pompey, meanwhile, had not been idle. He had seized the strategically vital port of Dyrrhachium, modern-day Durrës in Albania, and established a powerful defensive camp on a rocky coastal outcrop, the sea guarding his rear, the surrounding hills fortified with a continuous line of walls and garrison posts. Pompey was well supplied by sea, Caesar was not. Caesar attempted to encircle the Pompeian position with his own circumvallation, an ambitious ring of fortifications meant to cut off supplies and pressure Pompey towards surrender. Both armies settled into a grinding stalemate. Caesar's men foraged on increasingly stripped land. Disease crept through the camps. Then, in the summer of 48 BC, Pompey found and exploited a weakness in Caesar's fortification line, breaking through with enough force to rout part of the Caesarian formation entirely. Several hundred veteran soldiers and many officers were lost. Caesar was compelled to abandon his siege works and withdraw. It was the first substantive defeat Caesar had suffered in the civil war. The aura of his invincibility had cracked. But what followed in the days after Dyrrhachium revealed something essential about Caesar's character as a commander. He did not despair. He ordered a swift withdrawal east into the interior of Thessaly, where the land was richer and where he could link up with legions he had left in Macedonia, as well as reinforcements Mark Antony had brought across the Adriatic. Moving at night, securing defensible ground along the banks of the Enipeus River, he restored discipline through personal presence, rallied his shaken veterans, and waited as fresh troops arrived to bring his strength back to something near 30,000 infantry. His army, refed and reorganized, was ready once more. Pompey pursued. His advisors and senators who had followed him from Rome pressed him toward a decisive engagement. The battle they sought came on the 9th of August, 48 BC, near the ancient site of Pharsalus in central Thessaly, a flat plain beside the Enipeus River that would carry the name Pharsalus into history forever. The armies that faced each other that morning were vastly unequal in size. Pompey commanded roughly 63,000 troops, around 45,000 Roman legionaries, 15,000 auxiliary infantry including archers and slingers, and some 7,000 cavalry drawn from across the Eastern world. Caesar had perhaps 37,000 men in total, 27,000 veteran legionaries, 9,000 auxiliary infantry, and only about 1,000 cavalry. Pompey's plan was built around his overwhelming cavalry advantage. He positioned the bulk of his horsemen, 6,000 to 7,000 riders, on his far left flank, beside archers and slingers. His infantry would hold steady, absorbing the initial Caesarian charge and wearing down the attackers through fatigue and discipline. Then the cavalry would sweep around Caesar's exposed right flank, crash into his rear, and deliver the killing blow from behind while the infantry finished the work in front. It was a sound plan. Against most opponents it might well have worked, but Caesar anticipated it. Behind his own cavalry on the right flank, Caesar concealed a fourth line, 6 cohorts of veteran infantry, roughly 3,000 men, angled outwards and hidden from Pompeian view. When the battle began and Pompey's thousands of cavalry surged forward to overwhelm Caesar's thin screen of horsemen, Caesar gave the signal. The hidden cohorts advanced, raising their pila not as javelins to be thrown, but as spears to be thrust. Ancient accounts note that Caesar had specifically instructed his men to aim at the faces of the riders. The effect was decisive. The cavalry, expecting to sweep aside infantry, found themselves impaled and struck at close range, their formation dissolving into confusion and then rout. The exposed archers and slingers behind them were left defenseless. Caesar's infantry swept through them, turned inward, and delivered a massive strike into Pompey's unprotected left flank. Simultaneously, Caesar ordered his fresh third-line reserves, held back throughout the early fighting, to pour forward and reinforce the frontal assault. Pompey's left wing collapsed. The collapse spread. What had been a disciplined army of 60,000 became a rout measured in catastrophe. Pompeian dead numbered somewhere between 6,000 and 15,000. Around 24,000 were captured. Caesar's own losses were light, perhaps a few hundred to 1,200 men depending on the source. Pompey himself slipped away before the full weight of the disaster had fallen. He rode quietly out through his camp's gates, shed his general's cloak somewhere along the road, and made his way east to the city of Larissa in Thessaly. From there he took ship with a small escort, sailing south and east across the Aegean, his eye turned toward Egypt. He chose Egypt because it seemed logical, even hopeful. The Ptolemaic kingdom had long maintained friendly ties with Rome, and with Pompey's own family in particular, his father-in-law Ptolemy XII had been supported by Roman power. Pompey believed the young king Ptolemy XIII would welcome a powerful Roman ally, even a defeated one, as a valuable political asset. He arrived in September of 48 BC, anchoring his ship near Alexandria's shore. But the Egyptian court had already made its calculation. The kingdom was governed not truly by the boy king Ptolemy XIII, who was perhaps 11 years old at the time of his accession and no older than his mid-teens now, but by his regent, a powerful eunuch named Pothinus, alongside the Egyptian commander Achilles and an advisor named Theodotus of Chios. Together they weighed the situation with the cold logic of survival. Defeated Pompey, sheltered in Egypt, could invite Caesar's wrath. A Pompey handed over to Caesar as a gift, or rather his head, might secure Egypt's future. A small fishing boat was sent out to meet Pompey's ship. Among those aboard was a Roman mercenary named Lucius Septimius, who had once served under Pompey and whose familiar face put the general at ease. Pompey's wife, watching from the deck of the larger vessel, is said to have felt unease at the sight of the small, silent delegation. But Pompey stepped into the boat. He never reached the shore alive. Septimius drove a sword into his back. Achilles and a centurion named Salvius completed the killing with daggers. His head was severed and preserved. His ring was taken. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt shortly after, and was presented with the head of the man who had once been his rival, his son-in-law, the greatest general of his age, he turned away. He wept. Whatever Caesar had expected at the end of this long pursuit across the Mediterranean world, it had not been this. He ordered the head to be properly prepared and given a respectful burial. The signet ring was accepted in silence. Pompey's death did not bring the peace Caesar had perhaps imagined. It removed the last great military counterweight to his power. The Senate's ability to organize resistance had collapsed with the defeat at Pharsalus and now dissolved entirely with the death of its commander. Caesar stood in that autumn of 48 BC as the uncontested master of Rome's armed forces, a position that would lead in time to his appointment as dictator for life, and that already stirred quiet dread among those senators who understood what it meant for one man to hold such authority unchecked. But Caesar had not come to Egypt merely in pursuit of Pompey. He had arrived in a kingdom still smouldering with its own ancient rivalries. Rivalries between a boy king and his exiled sister, between palace factions and the old dynasties of the Ptolemaic line. Pompey was gone, but Caesar had arrived in a kingdom still burning with its own ancient rivalries, and the woman who had changed the course of Egyptian and Roman history was about to make herself known. Chapter 5: Caesar, Cleopatra, and Dictator of Rome: Conquest, Reform, and the Shadow of a Crown. In the autumn of 48 BC, The eastern Mediterranean world held its breath. The great civil war between Caesar and Pompey had already reshaped the Roman world, but one final unexpected chapter was about to unfold, not on a battlefield of rolling plains, but in the ancient lamplit corridors of Alexandria, Egypt. Caesar had arrived in the city pursuing Pompey, only to receive the most unsettling of news. His great rival had already been murdered, killed on the orders of the young King Ptolemy XIII, whose advisors believed the gesture would win Caesar's favour. It did not. Caesar is said to have wept at the sight of Pompey's severed head. Whatever his private feelings, the situation in Egypt demanded his full attention. Egypt in those months was a kingdom at war with itself. Ptolemy XIII, still a boy, shared the throne with his older sister Cleopatra VII, a joint monarchy bound by Egyptian tradition and frayed almost immediately by ambition. The real power behind Ptolemy was a eunuch regent named Pothinus, who had worked steadily to erase Cleopatra's name from official documents and force her into exile. She had not accepted her banishment quietly. Cleopatra had raised an army, and the two factions now faced each other across Egyptian soil. Into this conflict walked Julius Caesar, with only a few thousand soldiers and the full weight of Rome behind his name. Cleopatra was around 21 years old when she arranged her now famous approach to Caesar. She could not enter Alexandria openly. Her brother's forces controlled the city. The Greek biographer Plutarch, writing more than a century later, described her arriving hidden inside a rolled carpet or bed sack, carried by a servant and unrolled before Caesar in his private chamber. Other ancient writers offer different accounts. Cassius Dio suggests she arrived dressed attractively and speaking with great wit. Scholars today regard the carpet story as a later literary flourish, but the essential truth beneath it seems clear enough. Cleopatra was bold enough to take an extraordinary personal risk to reach Caesar, and whatever the precise manner of her entrance, it worked. She was not merely beautiful, she was a product of the Macedonian Greek Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt since the era of Alexander the Great, educated deeply in Hellenistic thought, and remarkable for her mastery of languages. She was said to be the first member of her dynasty to speak Egyptian itself. Contemporary descriptions paint a woman of sharp intelligence, political calculation, and formidable charisma. Caesar, a man who had seen much and was rarely surprised, was clearly moved by her. But any personal connection between them would have to wait. The situation outside the palace walls was quickly becoming dire. Pothinus had quietly arranged for the Egyptian general Achilles to march an army from Pelusium, perhaps 20,000 strong, to Alexandria. Caesar found himself essentially trapped inside the royal palace quarter. His small garrison surrounded, the harbour contested, and the water supply threatened when the Egyptians attempted to contaminate it. His soldiers were forced to dig wells inside their enclave simply to survive. What followed became known as the Alexandrian War, a months-long siege fought in the narrow streets and harbour waters of one of the ancient world's greatest cities. Caesar's forces set fire to the Egyptian fleet in the harbour to prevent it from being seized, and the blaze spread beyond the ships, consuming dockside warehouses and, according to ancient accounts, destroying tens of thousands of scrolls stored nearby. The Great Library of Alexandria was not destroyed outright. It continued to function in the years that followed, and later Roman officials would visit its collections. But part of the city's irreplaceable written heritage was lost that night, turned to ash on the harbour wind. The war dragged on through careful, grinding urban combat. Caesar seized Pharos Island, fought naval skirmishes, and endured repeated assaults. He reportedly even lost his own galley, at one point forced to swim to safety. Reinforcements eventually arrived, a relief force under Mithridates of Pergamum moving in from Syria, and with them Caesar was finally able to move beyond the defensive crouch his small force had held for months. The end came at the Battle of the Nile, early in 47 BC. Caesar's combined forces crossed the river on a makeshift bridge, routed the Egyptian army, and secured the victory. Ptolemy XIII, attempting to escape by ship, drowned when his vessel capsized in the chaos. The war was over. Cleopatra was restored to her throne, ruling now alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, with the full backing of Rome. Caesar remained in Egypt far longer than military necessity demanded, roughly 8 months in total. He and Cleopatra became lovers, and in June of 47 BC, she gave birth to a son. The child was named Ptolemy XV Caesar, and came to be known as Caesarion, Little Caesar. Ancient sources record that Caesar's own circle of friends acknowledged the child's paternity. Mark Antony would later declare him the true son of Caesar. Cleopatra's coins minted in 44 BC depicted her holding the infant, reinforcing the claim for all who looked upon them. Caesar never formally adopted the boy, and his heir Octavian would later deny the relationship entirely. But the combination of timing, name, and the testimony of those who knew Caesar well speaks quietly across the centuries. Caesar departed for Rome's Eastern Theatre in June or July of 47 BC, leaving Egypt behind but taking with him an entanglement that would echo for years. The East was not at rest. Pharsalus II, the son of the legendary Mithridates the Great, had seized the opportunity created by Rome's internal chaos to expand his kingdom. He had taken Colchis, Cappadocia, and Lesser Armenia, threatening Rome's authority in the province of Bithynia and Pontus. Caesar moved against him with characteristic speed. The Battle of Zela, fought on August 2nd of 47 BC, near the town of the same name in what is now Turkey, was over almost before it began. In just 5 days of campaigning, Caesar's veteran legions shattered Pharsalus' forces, captured his camp, and ended the threat in the east. It was after this victory that Caesar reportedly sent his famous dispatch to the Roman Senate, summed up in 3 words: Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Ancient sources differ on the precise form of the phrase. Plutarch records it spoken in conversation, Appian attributes it to a letter to the Senate, and Suetonius notes it was later displayed on a placard during Caesar's triumphal procession through Rome. However it was first uttered or written, it captured something essential about Caesar's way of doing things: swift, decisive, and utterly assured. By 46 BC, Caesar had returned to Rome to manage the unfinished business of the civil war in North Africa. The remnants of the Pompeian and senatorial Optimate forces had regrouped there under Quintus Metellus Scipio, supported by the Numidian king Juba I and veteran Pompeian generals including the formidable Titus Labienus. With them stood Marcus Porcius Cato, Cato the Younger, perhaps the most uncompromising defender of the old republic left alive. The Battle of Thapsus, fought on April 6th of 46 BC near the North African coast in what is now Tunisia, shattered this coalition. Caesar's forces overwhelmed the enemy, and the Republican cause in Africa collapsed. Cato, rather than accept Caesar's pardon, retreated to the city of Utica. There, in a manner that would be spoken of for generations, he dined quietly with friends, read Plato's Phaedo, a dialogue on the immortality of the soul, and then, with deliberate calm, took his own life. He survived his first wound only briefly. The attending physicians attempted to close the injury, and Cato tore it open again. He died as he had lived, immovably committed to his principles. To his admirers, his death was not a defeat. It was a statement, the last, most eloquent argument that a free Roman could make against what he saw as tyranny. Caesar would later be heard to say that Cato had robbed him of the opportunity to show mercy. Perhaps, but Caesar understood too what Cato's death meant. A dead Cato was harder to answer than a living one. One more campaign remained. In 45 BC, the sons of Pompey, Gnaeus and Sextus had gathered a new army in Hispania, joined again by Labienus and other veterans of the wars. The Battle of Munda, fought on March 17th of that year in the south of the Iberian Peninsula, proved to be the hardest fighting Caesar had ever known. Against a numerically superior enemy of roughly 70,000, his 8 legions struggled for 8 brutal hours. Caesar himself is said to have entered the fiercest fighting on the front line, and to have admitted afterward that on that day he had fought not for victory, but for his life. The enemy lost perhaps 30,000 men. The final organised resistance to Caesar's power was extinguished. Caesar returned to Rome victorious. In 46 BC, he celebrated 4 triumphs, each honouring a different campaign. The first commemorated his conquest of Gaul and the defeat of Vercingetorix. The second marked his Alexandrian victory in Egypt. The third honoured the swift conquest of Pharsalus at Zela. The fourth celebrated the African campaign against Metellus Scipio and King Juba. The city filled with processions, spectacles and the long columns of the defeated, and then Caesar set to work remaking Rome. His reforms were vast in scope and deliberate in purpose. The Roman calendar, which had drifted badly out of alignment with the actual seasons, a lunar-solar system of 355 days, patched irregularly with intercalary months that had long since lost their correspondence to nature, was replaced entirely. Working with Alexandrian astronomers, Caesar instituted a new solar calendar of 365 days, adding 10 days to existing months, and introducing a single leap day every 4th year. It took effect on the 1st of January 45 BC. The system, with minor adjustments made centuries later, is the calendar the Western world still uses today. The Senate, depleted by years of civil war deaths, was expanded from roughly 600 members to approximately 900. Caesar filled the new seats with equestrians, provincials, and men loyal to him, diluting the old aristocratic elite and bending the institution toward his purposes. Traditional senators watched this transformation with quiet unease. He settled his veterans in new colonies across Italy, Gaul, Hispania and North Africa, including the refounded cities of Carthage and Corinth, giving each soldier a parcel of land and a new life in a Romanized community built on a centuriated grid with its own forum and public buildings. He addressed the debt crisis that had plagued the Republic, limiting how much cash individuals could hold, requiring that debts be settled at pre-war property values, and organising public sales that eased the burden on those most crushed by the years of conflict. He extended Roman citizenship to communities in Cisalpine Gaul, the northern Italian territories that had long existed outside the full civic franchise, granting Latin rights and setting a precedent for the broader integration of the empire's peoples. He reorganised provincial administration, offered the Jews of Judea greater autonomy with tax reductions and exemption from military service, and launched extensive public works, canals, harbour improvements, marsh drainage, urban renewal. These were not the actions of a man content with mere victory. They were the actions of a man who intended to govern. And the Senate, watching, began to give him honours that edged steadily towards something older and more troubling than any consulship or dictatorship. Caesar was granted the title Praefectus Moribus, a censor-like authority over the Senate itself. He was permitted to wear the embroidered toga of a triumphata and a laurel wreath as permanent dress. A golden chair was placed for him in the Senate house. His image appeared on minted coins, the first time in Roman history that a living person's likeness had been stamped on currency, a practice reserved until then for gods and the long dead. Temples were renamed in honour of Venus Genetrix, his patron goddess. A statue of him was placed in a temple. The month of Quintilis was renamed Julius, July, in his honour. At the Lupercalia festival of February 44 BC, the ancient festival of purification, in which priests ran nearly naked through Rome's streets, striking women with strips of animal skin, something happened that the city did not soon forget. A new priestly college, the Juliani, had been created in Caesar's honour, with Mark Antony as its first magister. In front of the watching crowds, Antony approached Caesar, seated on his gilded chair, and placed a royal diadem upon his head. Caesar pushed it away. Antony offered it again. Caesar refused a second time. When voices in the crowd began to cry out, "Hail King Caesar!" Caesar seized the crown himself, removed it, and declared loudly that only Jupiter, not any mortal, could be king of the Romans. Ancient observers and later historians have turned this scene over endlessly, uncertain what to make of it. Was the refusal genuine? Was it theatre? A performance designed to test public opinion, or to offer the appearance of republican sentiment while leaving the door open? The very fact that a crown had been offered at all, and that Caesar had not simply had Antony arrested for the impudence, told many senators everything they felt they needed to know. Rome had expelled its last king in 509 BC, when Tarquinius Superbus was driven out after the rape of Lucretia. That expulsion had become a foundational myth of the Republic, the story Rome told itself about what it was and what it refused to be. The Latin word rex, king, had carried the weight of that memory for nearly 5 centuries. Later Roman rulers would go to extraordinary lengths to avoid the title, wrapping their power in other language. Caesar seemed either unwilling or unable to take such care. In the first weeks of February 44 BC, the Senate formally granted Caesar the title Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator for life. He had been dictator before, appointed and renewed in stages across the years of civil war, but Perpetuo was something different. It removed even the theoretical limit. It meant, for as long as he lived, Rome would be his to govern. He had already been stripping away the republican checks quietly, piece by piece. When the tribunes Gaius Appidius Marullus and Lucius Secetius Flavus challenged the honours being offered to him, he had them removed from their offices, violating the sacrosanct protections that made tribunes untouchable under Roman law. His coins bore the inscription Caesar Dixt Perpetuo. Elections were managed. Magistracies were assigned at his pleasure. The Senate met and voted, but it met and voted because Caesar allowed it to. Gaius Cassius Longinus was the first to begin drawing others into a plan. Through the winter of 44 BC, carefully and in quiet rooms, he gathered men who shared his alarm and his resolve. Eventually, the conspiracy would encompass roughly 60 senators, though only around 20 of their names have survived in the ancient record. They came for different reasons. Some were old republicans who genuinely had believed the institutions they served were worth dying for. Some had personal grievances. Some feared what Caesar's power, once fully consolidated, might do to men like them. Among them was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar had treated with particular favour, and who bore within him a complicated loyalty to both the man who had spared and promoted him, and to the ideals he believed that man now threatened. The conspirators considered whether to kill Mark Antony alongside Caesar. Brutus argued against it. The act should be targeted, precise and limited to Caesar alone. lest it appear as a broader purge rather than a principled act of tyrannicide. They agreed. Meanwhile, the city filled quietly with omens, or with stories of omens, as it always does when catastrophe approaches. A haruspex named Spurinna warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. Caesar reportedly replied that the Ides had come and he was still here. Spurinna answered that they had come, but not yet passed. Caesar's wife Calpurnia dreamed that their house fell, and that she held him wounded in her arms. Ancient writers would later record a long catalogue of prodigies, sacred arms clanging in the night, statues toppling, birds refusing to fly, a strange kingbird entering the hall of Pompey, only to be torn apart by others. Whether any of these signs were truly observed in those final days, or whether they were gathered and arranged afterward by a world still trying to understand how such a man could fall, it's impossible now to say. What is certain is that Caesar walked into the Senate on the 15th of March 44 BC and did not walk out again. Caesar had rebuilt Rome's institutions, reorganized her calendar, and settled her veterans. Yet in trying to save the Republic from chaos, he had given those who feared him every reason they needed to believe he must be stopped. Chapter 6. The Ides of March. Caesar's assassination, the aftermath and the legacy that outlasted Rome. In the final days before the Ides of March, the city of Rome seemed to hold its breath. The sky, according to those who recorded those uneasy hours, was not entirely quiet. Ancient sources speak of ghostly armies clashing in the clouds, of fiery streaks cutting through the darkness, of sacred fires that refused to stay lit, of statues that toppled without cause, and of the doors of the Temple of Jupiter swinging open on their own. Packs of dogs howled through the night. Birds and livestock moved strangely, and in the streets, so the stories would later tell, a lioness gave birth beneath the open sky. Whether these portents were real or were added by later hands to give the story its proper weight, they belong now to the atmosphere of those last days. A Rome that felt, in some quiet and unnameable way, that something irreversible was about to happen. The soothsayer Spurinna, an Etruscan haruspex, had already spoken his warning. After examining the entrails of a sacrificial victim and finding the heart missing, he had told Caesar plainly, danger would come within 30 days, ending on the Ides of March. Caesar had heard the warning. He had not turned away from what was coming. On the night before the 15th, his wife Calpurnia could not sleep. She dreamed that Caesar's statue burst open like a fountain, spilling a torrent of blood, and that crowds of Romans gathered around it, smiling, bathing their hands in the crimson stream. When the morning came, she begged her husband to stay home. At first, he agreed. He sat with her fears for a while as the city outside continued its slow, uncertain mourning. But then Decimus Junius Brutus arrived at the door. Decimus was not the Brutus history would most remember, but he was, in many ways, the one whose role mattered most that morning. He was a general who had served Caesar faithfully through the Gallic campaigns and the civil war against Pompey. Caesar trusted him deeply, trusted him enough to have named him a secondary heir in his will. Decimus spoke gently, persuasively. He told Caesar that the Senate was waiting, that to cancel now would embarrass him, that Calpurnia's dream was only a dream, and so Caesar rose, dismissed his wife's tears as cowardice, and walked out into the morning. The Senate had been called to meet not in the traditional curia in the Forum, that building had burned years before, but in the hall attached to the theatre of Pompey, in the Campus Martius, in the area now lying beneath the ruins known as Lago di Torre Argentina. It was a place where the rules were different, where personal bodyguards were not permitted to enter, where only senators were present. And so Caesar arrived without his guards, surrounded instead by men who had spent weeks quietly preparing for this moment. At the entrance, a man handed him a written message, a warning according to some accounts. Caesar did not read it. Inside, as Caesar took his seat, a senator named Lucius Tillius Cimber approached with a formal petition, requesting that a decree exiling his brother be revoked. It was a reasonable enough request. Other senators crowded forward, as if to add their voices to the plea. Caesar reached out to decline, and then the hand of the tribune Publius Servilius Casca came from behind, seized Caesar's toga and drove a blade toward his neck. Caesar cried out, the ancient sources record something close to, "This is violence," and grabbed Casca's arm. But Casca's brother struck next. Then Cassius, into his face some accounts say, then Decimus Brutus, into his ribs. And then, one after another, the remaining conspirators, 23 stab wounds in total, until Caesar fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, the very general he had defeated years before. Ancient historians agree that a single deep wound between the ribs was the one that killed him. The rapid loss of blood did what 22 other strikes had failed to do alone. As for his final words, history is honest in its uncertainty. Suetonius and Cassius Dio record a rumour that he said, in Greek, something meaning "you too, child," directed perhaps at Brutus. Plutarch records that he may have said nothing at all after a groan, and simply drew his toga over his face as he fell. The famous Latin phrase "et tu brute" does not appear in any ancient source. It would be left to Shakespeare, many centuries later, to give Caesar those particular words. Marcus Junius Brutus had not come easily to that room. Born around 85 BC, he was the son of a man killed by Pompey, the nephew of Cato the Younger, and the son of a woman named Servilia, who had herself been one of Caesar's closest intimates. Caesar had pardoned Brutus after the Battle of Pharsalus, had granted him prestigious posts, had treated him with what seemed like genuine affection. And yet when Caesar assumed the title of perpetual dictator in 44 BC, and began to accept the kinds of honours that suggested a monarch rather than a magistrate, Brutus had listened to Gaius Cassius Longinus, who had been quietly organising the conspiracy for months, and allowed his family's deep republican history to pull him toward what he believed was his duty. Cassius had his own reasons. He had served Pompey, been pardoned by Caesar, and never stopped distrusting the direction in which Caesar was pulling Roman power. Personal slights compounded his philosophical objections. Together, Brutus and Cassius had gathered perhaps 60 men into the conspiracy, men who believed, or told themselves they believed, that one death could restore the Republic. They were wrong. In the immediate hours after the assassination, the Senate dispersed in confusion. The conspirators attempted to present their act as liberation. They passed measures of amnesty. They spoke of restoring old orders, but the streets of Rome did not erupt in gratitude. The people were quiet at first, watchful, uncertain, and the silence had a heaviness to it that the conspirators had not anticipated. The man who understood the moment better than anyone was Mark Antony. Antony was serving as consul, the highest regular office in the Republic. After Caesar's death, he moved quickly and carefully. He secured Caesar's will and treasury. He obtained Senate approval for Caesar's existing measures. And then, on the 20th of March, he stood before the Roman people at Caesar's funeral and delivered an oration that ancient historians describe as brief but devastatingly effective, displaying Caesar's blood-stained toga, reminding the crowd of the dictator's generosity, and reading aloud from the will. The will revealed that Caesar had left 75 drachmas to every Roman citizen and had bequeathed his private gardens along the Tiber to the city for the public's enjoyment. It also named his great-nephew, the 18-year-old Gaius Octavius, as his principal heir, posthumously adopted, now legally Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. the crowd's grief transformed into something hotter. The flames of Caesar's funeral pyre roared out of control. The Forum nearly caught fire. The mob surged toward the homes of the conspirators. Soldiers were eventually needed to restore order. And the world the conspirators had imagined, a Rome restored to its old republican dignity, receded a little further with every burning branch thrown onto that pyre. Octavian had been in Illyria when Caesar died. He was 19 years old, with no military command and no official title. Yet he moved with the deliberateness that surprised nearly everyone who underestimated him, which was most people, including Antony, who saw the young heir as an insignificant boy who would wait his turn. Octavian raced back to Italy, announced his adoption, and used the enormous inheritance Caesar had left to pay the bequests promised in the will, winning the gratitude of the people Caesar had loved. He used that wealth to recruit former soldiers, bribed 2 of Antony's legions away from him, and forced his way into the Senate before the year was out. By the spring of 43 BC, he had marched on Rome with his own army. Cicero, Rome's greatest living orator, tried to shape this chaos into something salvageable for the Republic. He delivered a series of speeches, 14 in all, known as the Philippics, deliberately echoing Demosthenes' ancient attacks on Philip of Macedon, denouncing Antony as a tyrant and praising Octavian as a saviour. He believed the young heir could be used, guided, and then set aside when stability returned. He was mistaken. In late 43 BC, Octavian, Antony, and the general Lepidus reached an agreement. The Senate ratified it as the Second Triumvirate, granting the 3 men near dictatorial authority, the power to issue edicts, to legislate, to command armies, to appoint magistrates, to conduct prescriptions. Their first act was to post a list of enemies. Roughly 300 senators and equestrians were declared outlaws. Their property was confiscated. Rewards were offered for their capture. Cicero's name was on the list. His severed head and hands were displayed on the very rostra from which he had so often spoken. The war then moved east to find the men who had killed Caesar. Brutus and Cassius had gathered their forces in Macedonia. In October of 42 BC, on the plains near the ancient city of Philippi, they met the armies of Antony and Octavian. The battle came in 2 engagements. In the first, Cassius's forces were routed by Antony, but the dust and confusion of battle prevented Cassius from knowing how Brutus had fared on the other wing. From his position on a hill, convinced that both armies had been destroyed, Cassius ordered his freedman to kill him. He died before learning that Brutus had won his engagement that same afternoon. The loss of Cassius was irreparable. He was the most experienced military commander the Republicans had. 3 weeks later, Brutus's forces were crushed in the second battle, and rather than be taken prisoner, Brutus fell upon his sword. Plutarch records that his last words included praise for his friends who had not abandoned him, and a quiet lament borrowed from Euripides. With Philippi, the last armed resistance to Caesar's heirs was extinguished. What followed was a slow, decades-long transformation. Antony took the eastern provinces and fell into a relationship with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra VII, a union that was both a passionate alliance and a calculated political partnership. Antony fathered 3 children with Cleopatra and granted her and their children vast eastern territories in the so-called donations of Alexandria, distributing lands from Syria to Cyprus and beyond. Octavian's propaganda portrayed Antony as corrupted by the East, seduced away from Rome by an Oriental queen. The Roman elite was deeply alarmed. The confrontation came on the 2nd of September 31 BC, off the promontory of Actium in western Greece. Octavian's Admiral Agrippa commanded smaller, faster ships against Antony and Cleopatra's larger fleet. Cleopatra's squadron broke through the line and fled. Antony followed, abandoning his remaining forces. They surrendered. Antony died in Alexandria the following summer, on the 1st of August, 30 BC, by his own sword, having been told falsely that Cleopatra had already taken her own life. Cleopatra followed, a few days later, dying by suicide to avoid being paraded through Rome in chains. Her son Caesarion, Ptolemy XV, said to be the child of Julius Caesar himself, was lured back to Alexandria by Octavian and executed. The Ptolemaic dynasty ended there, quietly into the summer heat. Octavian returned to Rome the sole master of the Roman world, and then, with great care and considerable patience, he began the long work of making that mastery permanent without calling it what it was. On the 16th of January 27 BC, the Senate voted him the honorific title Augustus. He was given supreme command over the provinces and the army through a power known as Imperium Maius Proconsulare and the tribune's sacrosanct authority for life, which allowed him to veto any official act and stand as protector of the people. He kept the Senate, the magistracies, and the popular assemblies formally intact. He called himself not king, not dictator, but princeps, first citizen. The arrangement was known as the Principate. The Republic continued to exist in its forms and its names and its ancient offices, but it was governed now by one man, as it would be governed by one man's successors for centuries to come. The name Caesar travelled with the power. Augustus's successors adopted the name as their own, Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, and those who followed, until Caesar ceased to be a family name and became a title. Its echoes moved through time and across languages: Kaiser in German, Tsar in Russian, Kaiseri Rum claimed by the Ottoman sultans. The name of the man who fell at the foot of Pompey's statue on the 15th of March 44 BC became the word for emperor in the languages of peoples who had not yet been born when Rome was still a republic. His calendar, reformed in 46 BC with the help of the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, organised the year into the 12 months and the leap year cycle that would shape the Western world's reckoning of time for 16 centuries, until the Gregorian reform refined it further, keeping the Julian structure while correcting a small annual drift. The months Caesar organised are still the months used today. His writings survived. The Commentari de Bello Gallico and the Commentari de Bello Civili, his accounts of the Gallic campaigns and the Civil War, remain among the most elegant and carefully crafted works of Latin prose ever composed. Written in the third person, as though narrated by a calm and distant observer, they shaped how Rome remembered its wars with the Celts, and how later generations learned the Latin language itself. Students have been reading Caesar's sentences for 2,000 years, and his memory has never settled into a single shape. Ancient republicans like Cicero condemned him as a demagogue who dismantled the checks that had made Rome what it was. Biographers like Suetonius and Plutarch recorded his brilliance and his generosity alongside his ambition and his hubris. Renaissance thinkers admired his decisiveness and cited his crossing of the Rubicon as a model of bold political action. Poets and dramatists from Dante to Shakespeare turned him into something between history and myth. Rulers across Europe and beyond invoked his name to legitimize their own authority. Revolutionaries invoked his assassins to justify their resistance. Whether Caesar intended to make himself a king has never been resolved. Ancient sources and modern historians remain divided, some pointing to the perpetual dictatorship the diadem publicly offered and declined, the 1,000-member Senate, the extraordinary accumulation of honours, others pointing to his legislative reforms, his clemency, his rejection of the crown, his apparent desire to stabilize rather than to simply dominate. The question has been debated for 2,000 years and remains in some essential way open. What is not open is the world his death created. The conspirators who gathered in the hall of the theatre of Pompey believed that removing one man would restore a republic. Instead, they set in motion a chain of civil wars, proscriptions, and transformations that ended the republic more completely than Caesar's living presence ever had. And so the story of Julius Caesar ends not with his death, but with the world his life set into motion. A world of emperors bearing his name, of calendars he reformed, of battles still studied, and of a question that history has never fully answered. Was he the last great defender of an ambitious republic, or the first inevitable emperor of Rome?